And oftentimes I think when people think about the Ten Commandments or God commands in general, we kind of think that it's just some outdated, burdensome checklist of do's and don'ts that at the best you just kind of got to suck it up and muscle through and just kind of make it your way through. Or at worst, it's some kind of oppressive chains that just keep you from experiencing life and freedom, life to the full. But what I hope that you have seen so far in our study, and what I want to show you again this morning, is that in the Ten Commandments, God isn't trying to keep something good from us. Instead, he's trying to give us something great. You see, the Psalm 19 tells us that keeping God's commands, they refresh the soul. They give joy to the heart. That in keeping them, there is great reward. You see, the Ten Commandments aren't some burdensome chains. Instead, they are an invitation to a life of incredible freedom and blessing and joy. You see, they show a free people what it looks like to live in the freedom that God has bought for them. That's at the heart of what's going on with the Ten Commandments. And the problem is that all too often we think that we know better than God. We think that we know better than God. And nowhere in our culture is this tension more clear than in the way that we view the topic of the seventh commandment. And that's the topic of sexuality. See, our culture thinks that what the Bible has to say about sex is not only antiquated and backwards, but actually dangerous and even oppressive. But that's nothing new. You see, when Christianity was brand new in the Roman Empire thought that Christianity's view of sexuality was crazy. They were astonished by it. They were shocked by it. They thought it was not only unhealthy, they thought it was impossible. You see, the reality is that both the ancient Romans and our culture today, we fundamentally operate out of the belief that we should always follow the desires of our heart and that we are freest when we are unhindered from following those desires, that we should always follow the desires of our heart and that we are freest when there aren't any rules that keep us from following those desires. But what the Bible and the honest test of reality both show us is that real freedom isn't found by living in light of our unhindered desires. You see, real freedom is found by living in light of God's good design that he has made for us. In the late 1960s, there was a guy by the name of George Leonard, and he was the primary editor, the senior editor at a popular magazine of the day, and he used his position there to promote the sexual revolution of the 60s. But decades later, in a book that he wrote called The End of Sex, Leonard expresses a surprisingly different position. He writes this, he says, "The sexual revolution has not done what its proponents claimed it was doing. It has not enhanced sex. Instead, it has only cheapened love." He says, "I was a proponent of the sexual liberation, but now I see that sex has rules, and unless you play by those rules, sex can create a depth of loneliness like nothing else can." You see, what Leonard found was that the reality is that just like the goldfish who tries to liberate itself from the confines of its tank finds only death instead of freedom, so too do we when we try to liberate ourselves from the confines of God's good and gracious design for our lives and for our sexuality. We don't find life. We don't find freedom. We don't find blessing. We find pain. We find death. We find loneliness. You see, so many of us resist what God's word has to say about the idea of sex and sexuality because we think that we're going to miss out on something. You see, but the reality is that God's word for us tells us what it does about sex precisely because it doesn't want us to miss out on something. And so that's what I want to show you this morning. See, as we study the seventh command, is that in calling his people to a radical sexual purity, God is actually protecting for us the radiant gift of sexual intimacy, and he's doing that for our good, but more than anything, he's doing it for his glory.